The birth of the warrior code in the mist-covered valleys of ancient Japan, when the rising sun painted the sky with crimson fire. The land itself seemed torn between chaos and destiny. Mountains stood as silent witnesses to centuries of tribal conflict, where loyalty was fragile and honor was the only law that mattered. Long before Japan became a united empire. It was a patchwork of clans, each ruled by its own code, its own pride, and its own sword. The Taira and Minamoto clans were the most powerful among them. Their rivalry burned like an eternal flame, fueled by generations of vengeance and ambition. Villages vanished in their wars, rivers ran murky with the dust of battles. And yet, in this age of turmoil, something greater was being born, the spirit of the Bushi, the warrior. Amidst the turmoil, a young warrior named Minamoto no Yoshitsune trained in the silent courtyards of a mountain temple. His swordsmanship was unmatched, his heart disciplined by the monks who taught him not just how to fight, but why. He was told that a true warrior's strength came not from anger, but from restraint, from understanding when to draw the blade and when to sheath it. Far to the west, the Taira clan ruled Kyoto, their banners red with the symbol of the rising sun. Led by the cunning Taira no Kiyomori, they controlled the imperial court and shaped the will of the emperor himself. The Minamoto were scattered, hunted, waiting for the day they could rise again. That day was drawing near. Yoshitsune's brother, Yoritomo, carried the burden of vengeance. He had watched his family destroyed by the Taira and swore that one day the Minamoto name would return to power. But unlike the old lords who fought for land, Yoritomo sought to build something new, a Japan ruled not by bloodlines, but by loyalty and discipline. It was the spark that would ignite the creation of a warrior code, the beginning of Bushido. As the wind swept through Kamakura's fields, Yoritomo gathered the loyal remnants of the farmers, monks and samurai answered his call not for gold, but for honor. The night before the first great battle, Yoshitsune stood beneath the falling cherry blossoms, the petals drifting like soft snow. "If we fall," he said to his men, "let it be with honor. Let the heavens remember our courage." The next dawn saw the clash of two worlds. The Taira, proud in their armor of red and gold, advanced with drums echoing through the valley. The Minamoto, fewer in number but stronger in resolve, met them with silence, for they had already accepted death. Swords clashed, arrows tore through the morning haze, and thunder roared from human hearts. By the day's end, the valley was quiet again. The Taira had retreated, but at a cost. The Minamoto too had lost many of their own, yet Yoritomo did not mourn. He walked among the fallen and whispered, "Their spirits rise with us." That night, he wrote the first words of what would later become the way of the samurai: to live with honor, to die with honor, to protect without fear. From the ashes of endless war, the code of the warrior was born, not carved in stone, but written in the hearts of those who followed it. And as dawn broke again over Japan, the age of the samurai had begun. The shadows of loyalty and silence in the dim light of dawn, Kyoto still whispered the prayers of the night before. The morning mist rolled down from the northern hills, veiling the wooden rooftops and temple bells. Beneath that silence, something unseen moved the invisible currents of loyalty and betrayal that shaped Japan's destiny. After centuries of clan rivalries, the emperor's authority had waned into a distant echo. The real power rested in the hands of men with blades at their sides and oaths in their hearts, the samurai. But even among them, honor was a fragile thing, carried like a lantern through a storm. In the shadow of the Heian court, two families, the Taira and the Minamoto, stood on opposite sides of ambition. Both claimed loyalty to the emperor, yet each secretly prepared for war. It was an age when silence could be deadlier than a sword. Taira no Kiyomori, the man who had risen from a coastal warrior to the ruler of Japan, now sat in his Kyoto residence surrounded by gold and silence. His face was calm, yet behind his eyes burned the fire of insecurity. Every bow he received from the nobles felt like a dagger waiting to turn. Every whisper in the corridor carried the weight of treason. Far from the capital, in a mountain stronghold of the Minamoto clan, a young general named Yoritomo trained his men in discipline and silence. He had survived defeat once, banished, exiled, humiliated, but his resolve had turned harder than steel. He knew that the world of samurai was not built on mercy. It was built on patience, loyalty, and vengeance. As the winds of power shifted, the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, began to evolve from mere obedience to a sacred path of duty and honor. It demanded that a samurai serve his lord without hesitation, even unto death. But what if the lord himself strayed from the path? Could loyalty still remain pure? In the temples, monks debated the meaning of virtue, while the courtiers drank tea and planned new alliances. Yet beneath that fragile peace, assassins moved through Kyoto's alleys like shadows chasing the moon. A single misstep, a single rumor, and the empire could ignite. One evening, as a crimson sunset painted the Como River, a secret messenger rode through the capital. His scroll, sealed in wax, carried the fate of clans. Inside it was a name, the name of a traitor who had betrayed the Minamoto for gold. When the scroll reached Yoritomo's hands, he said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "Silence is the blade that cuts deepest." The night that followed became legend. No war drums were beaten, no banners raised. Only silence. Under the dim moonlight, a band of masked warriors moved through the mountain mist. By dawn, the traitor's home lay empty, his fate swallowed by the fog. The code of loyalty had spoken without words, without mercy. In the capital, Kiyomori heard of it and smiled coldly. Even in exile, he murmured, the Minamoto still breathe fire. He looked toward the eastern horizon, where the first rays of dawn touched the distant mountains. Then let the winds of war return. Let Japan remember what silence sounds like before the storm. As spring arrived, cherry blossoms fell like pink snow upon Kyoto's gardens, but the beauty carried sorrow. The nobles, dressed in silk, reciting poems about transience, while the warriors polished their blades, reciting prayers for survival. Every falling petal became a reminder. Beauty and death were the same breath in the way of the samurai, and so the quiet years came to an end. From Kyoto to Kamakura, from mountain shrines to coastal villages, the drums began to echo again. The oath of loyalty would soon be tested not by words or honor, but by the clash of armies under banners of red and white. Japan was awakening, and the shadows of loyalty were about to give birth to the thunder of destiny, the Mongol storm. The year was 1274, and the sea that had long guarded Japan like a sacred moat was no longer silent. Far beyond the horizon, in the lands of the Great Khan, an empire unlike any the world had ever seen was rising. The Mongols, from the frozen steppes of Asia to the gates of Europe, they had swept across continents like an unstoppable storm. Now their gaze turned east, toward the islands of the rising sun. In Kamakura, the shogunate stood uneasy. Reports from the west spoke of emissaries, Mongol envoys bearing scrolls written in gold ink, demanding submission in the name of Kublai Khan. The shogun's council met under the dim lanterns of a cold night, their faces stern with silence. Japan bows to no emperor but her own, declared Hojo Tokimune, the young regent of Japan. Let them come. The sea will judge us. Months passed, and the wind changed. From the coast of Korea, the Mongol fleet gathered hundreds of ships, filled with soldiers, catapults, and the thunder of war drums that could be heard across the waves. They sailed beneath black banners painted with the seal of the Khan, confident that another kingdom would soon fall to their might. But Japan was no ordinary land. Its warriors had been raised not merely to fight, but to die with honor. The samurai stood on the beaches of Hakata Bay, armor gleaming like scales of iron dragons beneath the gray sky. Banners fluttered, prayers whispered, and every man knew that his fate might end before sunset. When the Mongol ships appeared on the horizon, the people of Kyushu felt the ground tremble. Arrows blazed across the sky, and thunder bombs, the Mongol-s strange weapons, burst with fire and smoke that blinded horses and men alike. For the first time, the samurai faced a new kind of war, one of coordination and terror. Unlike their honorable duels of blade against blade, yet courage burns brightest in the heart of chaos. Among the defenders stood Takazaki Suenaga, a samurai who recorded his battles with the Mongols. He wrote of how the invaders advance like a dark tide, only to meet the fierce resistance of warriors who fought not for conquest, but for the soul of their homeland. He wrote, even when the sky turned black and the sea roared with fire, the spirit of Japan did not bend. For 2 days, the battle raged. Then, on the third night, the wind began to howl, a strange, furious wind that grew stronger with every passing hour. The Mongols, trapped by their own anchors, could not flee. By dawn, the storm had become a tempest. Ships crashed against each other, splintering like bones. The sea swallowed men, horses, and weapons alike. When morning came, the horizon was filled with wreckage. Thousands of Mongol ships had vanished beneath the waves. The survivors washed ashore only to meet the blades of waiting samurai. Japan had been saved not by men alone, but by the storm that history would call kamikaze, the divine wind. In Kamikura, when word of victory reached Hojo Tokimune, he said nothing. He walked to a temple, knelt before a statue of Buddha, and whispered, "We did not fight alone." He knew the storm was more than a miracle. It was a warning. The Mongols would return, and they did. 7 years later, stronger, fiercer, and with vengeance burning in their hearts. But Japan was ready. Fortress walls rose along Hakata Bay, new ships were built, and the spirit of the samurai hardened like tempered steel. As the second invasion loomed, monks across Japan prayed, soldiers sharpened their blades, and the people whispered to the sea once more, "Blow again, O divine wind, protect this land of honor." In the roar of that coming storm, Japan would face its destiny. A nation tested not by conquest, but by faith in the unseen hand of its gods, and the unyielding courage of its warriors. Winds of pride, and aftermath story begins. The sea had swallowed empires before, but never had the world seen a storm like this. When the Mongol fleet descended upon Japan, it came with the promise of annihilation. Thousands of ships carrying soldiers from every corner of the Yuan Empire, believing that the island of the gods would kneel before their emperor. But nature, it seemed, had chosen its side. The skies turned black as night, winds howled like beasts, and the waves rose in walls of fury. The storm, later called kamikaze, the divine wind, tore through the Mongol armada, smashing ships against each other, drowning legions, and scattering survivors across the cold Pacific waters. When dawn finally broke, the sea was calm again, but filled with shattered wood, broken armor, and the silent echo of a failed conquest. Japan had survived, but victory, though divine, came with a price. In the aftermath, the Japanese celebrated the storm as a gift from the gods, a sign that their land was sacred and untouchable. Shrines were built, prayers were offered, and the word kamikaze became holy. Yet beneath the hymns of gratitude lay an uneasy truth. Japan had not truly defeated the Mongols. The heavens had, and that realization began to gnaw at the pride of men who lived and died by the sword. The shogunate in Kamakura stood firm, but its roots began to tremble. The samurai who had prepared for a great battle found themselves without spoils. They had trained, sacrificed, and waited for glory, but the storm had stolen their war. They returned to empty homes and unpaid promises. Whispers of discontent crept through the warrior clans. In hidden courtyards and dim-lit inns, the samurai spoke of honor and the weight of being forgotten. Is a warrior still a warrior? One asked if the gods fight his battles for him. The Kamakura shogunate tried to mend the cracks by rewarding its most loyal vassals, but the treasury was drained. The cost of defense, walls, ships, fortifications had bled Japan dry. Taxes rose, resentment grew, and for the first time, the unity that had bound the samurai began to falter. Still, outwardly, Japan shone with pride. The monks told stories of the divine wind, turning it into legend. Children grew up hearing that their ancestors had been protected by heaven itself. The tale of the storm became not just a story, but an identity, one that would echo across centuries. But pride is a double-edged sword. In the quiet after the storm, the samurai began to lose their way. The art of the sword was no longer just about defense or duty. It became a means of proving superiority. Duels began to replace diplomacy, and rival clans started testing their strength against one another. The spirit of Bushido, once a path of self-control and loyalty, started to twist into a hunger for recognition. The temples that once guided the warriors now struggled to remind them of humility. Zen masters spoke of balance, warning that pride could destroy what even storms could not. But few listened. The divine victory had planted a dangerous seed, the belief that Japan was untouchable. In Kamakura, the shogun's advisors grew paranoid. If the gods had favored them once, would they do so again? Or had they spent their divine protection too early? The court fell into superstition, while distant provinces drifted toward chaos. Years passed, and the memory of the storm became both shield and shackle. Samurai still carried their blades, but many no longer knew what they were defending. The people respected them, feared them, but no longer understood them. Honor had become a story told by the old, while the young saw only power, and so began the slow unraveling of the warrior's soul, a decline masked by festivals, poetry, and prayer. Japan had won the battle against the invader, but it was losing the battle within. The winds that once saved the nation now whispered of change, carrying with them the scent of decay, ambition, and a new age that would not be guided by gods, but by men. The rise of the Ashikaga story begins. The storm had passed, but Japan was no longer the same. The once mighty Kamakura shogunate, born in the age of the Minamoto, now stood hollow, a shell of authority trembling beneath its own pride. The divine wind had saved Japan from foreign conquest, but it could not save the nation from itself. Across the provinces, resentment simmered. Samurai who had shed blood in the name of the shogun were left unrewarded, their loyalty repaid with silence. The peasants groaned under rising taxes, the monks warned of corruption, and in the north, the first whispers of rebellion began to stir. From those whispers rose a name, Ashikaga Takauji. He was a man of ambition and contradiction, born into a proud samurai clan that had long served the Kamakura shoguns. Takaguchi was both a product of loyalty and a victim of it. He had fought for the shogunate in its wars against imperial loyalists, yet what he saw in those battles changed him forever. He saw how power twisted honor, how rulers hid behind prayers and decrees while their warriors starved for meaning. The Kamakura court had become blind to its own decay. The Hojo regents, who ruled in the name of the shogun, grew arrogant, isolated from the suffering of their people. They built fortresses and shrines, clinging to the belief that divine favor was eternal. But heaven's silence had become deafening. It was then that the emperor, long a symbolic figurehead in Kyoto, began to stir once more. Emperor Go-Daigo, bold and defiant, sought to reclaim the throne's true power. He spoke not of gods, but of justice, of restoring the rightful rule of the imperial line. His call spread like wildfire among the disillusioned. Ashikaga Takauji was sent by the shogunate to crush this imperial rebellion. But destiny had other plans. When Takauji's army faced the emperor's forces, something within him broke. The loyalty he had sworn to Kamakura no longer felt sacred. It felt like a chain. In the quiet before battle, as dawn light spilled across the fields of Kyoto, Takauji made a choice that would shatter Japan's order forever. He turned against the shogunate. His men followed him, not out of fear, but out of belief. For the first time in generations, a samurai fought not for his master, but for his own conviction. With cunning strategy and ruthless speed, Takauji captured Kyoto, driving the Hojo forces into retreat. Emperor Go-Daigo restored the imperial rule, the Kenmu restoration, and the people cheered, believing that the age of warriors had ended. But history rarely grants such peace. Takauji soon discovered that the emperor's dreams were not his own. Go-Daigo's rule grew rigid, favoring courtiers and scholars over the warriors who had fought to restore him. The samurai, who had tasted independence, began to feel betrayed once again. And so, in a twist as cruel as it was inevitable, Ashikaga Takauji, once the emperor's savior, became his greatest rival. In 1336, Takaguji's forces clashed with the imperial army near Kyoto. The skies were thick with smoke and betrayal. By sunset, the emperor's banners had fallen, and Takaguji had carved his name into history. He entered Kyoto not as a servant, but as a ruler. A new shogunate was born, the Ashikaga shogunate, the second great military government of Japan. The age of the samurai had entered a new chapter, one of elegance, politics, and quiet decay. Under the Ashikaga, art and war walked hand in hand. Temples flourished, Zen philosophy deepened, and the tea ceremony became a symbol of discipline amid chaos. But beneath the calm, old rivalries festered. Takauji had won his empire through rebellion, and rebellion, it seemed, was the price his heirs would forever pay. As Kyoto rebuilt under Ashikaga rule, the city gleamed like gold, yet its alleys whispered of treachery. Samurai lords plotted in the shadows, monks debated destiny, and peasants prayed for peace that never came. The storm that once saved Japan had become a memory, and the land stood at the edge of a new kind of battle, not of swords and ships, but of loyalties and legacies. The tiger and the dragon Japan had entered an age of chaos. Under the rule of the Ashikaga shogunate, peace was an illusion, a fragile mask over a nation divided by ambition. The shoguns ruled Kyoto with grace and ceremony, but beyond the capital, the provinces burned. Every lord, every samurai clan dreamed of power. From this storm of rivalries, two names began to echo across the mountains and rivers: Takeda Shingen and Wazugi Kenshin. They were not mere generals. They were living symbols of what Japan had become: proud, disciplined, and bound by honor. Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, was a man of sharp intellect and iron will. His armies moved like a silent storm, swift and precise. He believed that true power lay not in destruction but in control, to rule the land with wisdom, not fear. His banners carried the words Frinkazan, swift as the wind, silent as the forest, fierce as fire, immovable as the mountain. Wazugi Kenshin, the dragon of Ekigo, was his mirror and his rival. A devout Buddhist, he fought not for wealth or conquest, but for justice. To his men, he was more than a warlord. He was a protector of the innocent, a monk in armor. His fortress stood among the snow-capped peaks of Ekigo, where he prayed before every battle, asking the gods not for victory, but for righteousness. Their paths were destined to collide. For years, their armies faced each other across the plains of Kawanakajima, a small valley that became a legend. 5 great battles were fought there, each one shaping the myth of the tiger and the dragon. The clashes were brutal and brilliant, filled with cunning strategies and heroic charges. Yet, even in the heart of war, both men shared a strange respect, a bond only warriors could understand. One night, during a temporary truce, Kenshin sent salt to Shingen's province after learning his rival was under blockade. Wars should be fought with swords, not hunger, he wrote. Such gestures of honor became stories whispered for generations. The Battle of Kawanakajima in 1561 was their greatest encounter. Mist covered the valley as both armies moved before dawn. Shingen's forces formed an intricate trap designed to crush Kenshin's army from both sides. But Kenshin anticipated the move, striking deep into the enemy's heart before the jaws of the trap could close. Legend says that amidst the chaos, Kenshin himself rode through the lines and charged straight at Shingen's command tent. The tiger and the dragon met face to face, one with a sword, the other with a war fan. For a few breathless moments, the fate of two provinces hung between them. Shingen parried Kenshin's strikes with his iron fan until his guards rushed in to defend him. Kenshin withdrew, his armor streaked with dust and glory. Neither man truly won that day. Both claimed victory, both suffered loss. But in the end, their rivalry became something far greater than war. It was a story of respect, of two souls who understood that honor was not about conquest, but about purpose. Years later, Takeda Shingen would fall ill during his campaigns, leaving behind a vast and disciplined domain. Kenshin, upon hearing of his rival's death, mourned in silence, lighting incense for the man he once fought. As time passed, the age of the great daimyo grew darker. The Ashikaga shogunate had lost its power completely. Japan was now a nation of countless warlords, each carving their own path in the fractured land. The Warring States period, the Sengoku Jidai, had fully begun. In this storm, the legacy of the tiger and the dragon lived on. They had fought not for greed, but for something rare, the belief that even in war there could be honor. The warlord's dream and fall. In the fading embers of Japan's warring age, one man dreamed of an empire forged from chaos. His name was Oda Nobunaga, the man who sought to unite Japan under a single sword. But power, like a double-edged blade, cuts not only the enemy, it cuts the hand that wields it. Nobunaga had risen higher than any before him. Castles that once belonged to rival lords now bore his banner, and armies moved at his command like extensions of his will. His brilliance in war was unmatched. Guns thundered under his strategy, castles burned in his wake, and even the emperor himself whispered Nobunaga's name with awe. Yet, in the quiet corridors of Kyoto and the restless minds of his generals, envy began to smolder. He was ruthless, yes, but visionary too. He sought a Japan free of endless war, where merchants could prosper and soldiers could return home. But to achieve peace, he first had to wield terror. Those who defied him were erased from the map. Temples that harbored rebels were silenced, their bells replaced by the echo of gunfire. His methods carved fear into the hearts of many, and from that fear rose both loyalty and hatred. Among his most trusted men was Akechi Mitsuhide, a samurai of noble birth and sharp intellect. Nobunaga had given him honor, rank, and purpose. Yet Nobunaga's temper was fierce, and humiliation was his favorite punishment. In one fateful gathering, before other generals, he mocked Mitsuhide for a failed campaign, words that cut deeper than any sword. Days later, when Nobunaga entered Kyoto's Hannoji Temple with only a small guard, Mitsuhide saw his moment. He turned his army not against the enemies of Nobunaga, but against Nobunaga himself. As dawn broke, the sound of battle echoed within the sacred walls, Nobunaga's. Men fell one by one, and the temple burned with the rising sun. Surrounded and betrayed, the warlord who dreamed of peace faced his final hour. They say he met his end not with fear, but with defiance. Before the flames reached him, Nobunaga drew his blade one last time and took control of his fate. Thus ended the man who had almost changed Japan forever. But the story of unification did not end in that fire. From the ashes of Nobunaga's ambition would rise another, his loyal general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man born not of nobility but of willpower. The dream that Nobunaga started was not dead. It had simply found a new vessel. The rise of Hideyoshi's story begins. The thunder that had once shaken Kyoto had gone silent. The flames of war that Oda Nobunaga had ignited were now smoldering in the ashes of ambition across Japan. Whispers filled the air. The demon king is gone. But in the shadow of that loss rose a man no one had expected to lead. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant, the soldier once mocked for his humble birth, was about to carve his name into the heart of Japan's destiny. In the dying embers of Nobunaga's dream, Hideyoshi saw something others could not. Not ruin, but opportunity. Where others mourned the fall of the Oda clan, he saw a path illuminated by loyalty and strategy. His rise was not sudden. It was forged through years of watching, learning, and waiting. He had seen lords kill for power, samurai die for pride, and clans dissolve for the sake of vengeance. Hideyoshi understood one thing better than anyone else. Power was not inherited, it was earned. After Nobunaga's death at Honnoji, chaos returned like a beast freed from its cage. Old alliances broke apart, new enemies rose, and every warlord claimed to be the rightful heir to the fallen ruler's vision. But Hideyoshi moved faster than any of them. He marched day and night, gathering what was left of Nobunaga's army. His voice carried the weight of purpose. "We will avenge our lord," he said. Yet beneath that oath was a hidden truth. He wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting to reshape Japan itself. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Yamazaki in 1582. The morning mist hugged the mountains as Hideyoshi's forces faced Akechi Mitsuhide, the man who had betrayed Nobunaga. The tension in the air was sharp enough to cut through armor. Then, as the sun climbed higher, Hideyoshi's banner, the golden gourds, rose against the sky, shimmering like an omen. His soldiers, a mix of peasants, ronin, and loyal samurai, charged with cries that echoed across the valley. By nightfall, Mitsuhide's army had broken. The traitor fled, and soon after met his end. Hideyoshi did not celebrate. He simply stood on the battlefield, looking over the horizon, knowing this was only the beginning. Japan had been avenged, but it was still divided. The clans Takeda, Wazugi, Shimazu, Mori all watched him, uncertain whether to bow or to fight. He chose diplomacy where others would have chosen steel. Through marriage alliances, gifts, and patient negotiations, he pulled the fractured pieces of Japan toward unity. And when words failed, he did not hesitate to wield his sword. One by one, the great lords began to bend the knee, not out of fear, but out of awe. Hideyoshi's castle at Osaka rose as a symbol of his new power. It stood like a mountain of gold and stone, its walls glittering under the sun. Merchants, monks, and warriors all came to witness the miracle, the peasant who had become a lord. Yet within that splendor, the shadows of ambition whispered again. Some called him the monkey, others the unifier, but no one could deny that his mind was sharper than any blade. He introduced reforms that no ruler before him had dared to attempt. Peasants were separated from warriors, the lands were surveyed, and the law of the sword was rewritten. He sought not endless war, but order, a new Japan where chaos would no longer rule. Yet, deep within his heart, Hideyoshi still hungered for something greater, a dream that reached beyond the islands. As the years passed, he began to imagine a Japan that would dominate Asia. Korea was to be the first step, a bridge to the vast empire of China. His advisors were divided. Some whispered that the dream was too vast. Others feared the gods themselves would turn against him. But Hideyoshi's will was iron. "If heaven denies me," he said once, "then I will build my own heaven upon the earth." But power is a mountain that few can descend once they've climbed it. The more he built, the more the ground beneath him trembled. The warriors who once followed him began to question his vision. The lords who had bent the knee now whispered of rebellion. And as his armies sailed toward Korea, his strength began to wane, not from the enemy, but from within. In the moonlight of Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi would sometimes walk alone, his armor laid aside, his thoughts heavy. He had united Japan, something no warlord before him had truly done. Yet peace, once achieved, seemed to slip further from his grasp. The same flames that had lifted him were now consuming him, little by little. Still, the legend of Toyotomi Hideyoshi endured, the man who rose from peasantry to power, from the dust to the throne. His story was a mirror to Japan itself, a tale of ambition, loyalty, and transformation. And though he would one day fall, the empire he forged would not easily forget his name. The death of a dream story begins. Night had settled over Osaka Castle like a heavy shroud. The lamps flickered along the stone corridors, casting long shadows that danced against the golden walls. In the highest chamber, Toyotomi Hideyoshi sat in silence. Before him lay maps of distant lands, Korea, China, and the seas that separated them. His hands, once steady as steel, now trembled slightly as he touched the parchment. The dream that had once burned so brightly within him was beginning to fade. The Korean campaign had begun with thunder. In 1592, his armies had crossed the sea with unmatched force, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, banners high, and faith unshaken. Hideyoshi had imagined a swift conquest, a bridge of victories leading Japan into a new age of power. But the gods of war are never loyal for long. What awaited them on the Korean shores was not triumph, but endurance, hunger, and the slow decay of ambition. The Japanese forces, though fierce, faced a nightmare of resistance. The Korean defenders, aided by Ming China, struck back with new weapons, new tactics, and unyielding courage. The supply lines faltered. Soldiers who had once shouted Hideyoshi's name now whispered it in exhaustion. The sea that had carried them to glory became a graveyard of ships, shattered by storms and enemy fire. Back in Japan, whispers turned to doubt. Why fight for lands we cannot hold? The lords murmured. Why chase a dream beyond the sea when our own soil grows restless? Hideyoshi's court grew quiet, his generals uncertain, and in that silence, a deeper fear began to take root. The fear that the great unifier of Japan had begun to lose his grasp on reason. Yet Hideyoshi refused to bend, but in his eyes still burned the fire of the peasant who had conquered lords. I was born with nothing, he told his closest advisers, and I made the world bow. You think I will stop now? His words echoed through the hall, but they were no longer met with the same loyal fire. The faces around him had grown older, wearier, and more cautious. The years dragged on, and the war drained Japan of strength and spirit. The once glorious Osaka castle now felt like a gilded cage. Inside Hideyoshi's son, the young Hideyori grew under the watchful eyes of his father's loyal retainers. Hideyoshi knew that time was no longer his ally. Age had crept into his bones, and the weight of his empire pressed upon his heart. One night, as the rain lashed against the stone walls, he called for Ishida Mitsunari, one of his most trusted men. When I am gone, Hideyoshi said softly, protect my son, keep the Toyotomi name alive. His voice, once filled with command, now carried the quiet tone of a man staring into eternity. Mitsunari bowed deeply, but in his heart he feared what was coming. The vultures of ambition had already begun to circle. As Hideyoshi's health faded, Japan trembled again. The lords who had once united under his banner began to prepare for a new struggle. The Tokugawa clan, led by the calm and calculating Ieyasu, watched and waited. He had seen many men rise and fall, and he understood the rhythm of power, when to wait, when to strike, and when to claim what others leave behind. In 1598, the inevitable came. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who had risen from dust to dominion, closed his eyes for the last time. The castle bells tolled across the land, echoing through mountains and villages alike. To the peasants, he was a legend. To the samurai, a paradox. To history, a man who had dreamed too greatly and reached too far, but even in death, his shadow did not vanish. The boy Hideyori was too young to rule, and the council Hideyoshi had formed to protect him soon fractured. Loyalty gave way to greed, friendship to rivalry. The unity that had taken decades to build began to crumble in mere months. The dream of a stable, peaceful Japan began to die, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The warlords gathered their armies once more. The banners of the clans rose against the wind, and the drums of war returned to the valleys that had known only silence for years. And far away in the east, Tokugawa Ieyasu began his quiet preparations. He did not need fire or thunder to announce his coming. He only needed time, and time at last belonged to him. The dream that Hideyoshi had built upon sweat and steel was fading into the night. The man who had united Japan had unknowingly sown the seeds of its next great war. For in the ashes of peace, ambition always finds new life. The Tokugawa peace and the fading blade. In the cold morning mist of the year 1600, the fields of Sekigahara stood silent, waiting for the sound of destiny. Thousands of samurai from across Japan gathered beneath their banners, each one carrying not only a sword but the weight of centuries of honor and revenge. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient strategist who had survived every storm. On the other, Ishida Mitsunari, the proud defender of the old Toyotomi legacy, between them the soul of Japan itself. As dawn broke, drums thundered across the valley, echoing through the fog like the heartbeat of history. Arrows sliced the air, steel clashed with steel, and the ground trembled under the march of warriors. The Battle of Sekigahara had begun, the storm that would decide the fate of an entire nation. For hours, the two armies fought with unmatched fury. The valley turned into a blur of armor and cries of banners torn apart by the winds of chaos. Ieyasu stood calm at the center of it all, his eyes steady, his commands measured. He was not fighting merely for victory, but for the soul of Japan's future, a peace that could only be born from total order. As betrayal rippled through Ishida's ranks, the balance began to shift. Old allies turned their banners, joining Tokugawa's side. The fog lifted, and so did the illusion of loyalty. By afternoon, the outcome was clear. The age of endless war was ending, and a new ruler was rising. When the last banner of Ishida fell, Ieyasu looked across the valley, his face lit by the pale sun. The dream of unity was no longer a dream. It had been carved into the earth. In the years that followed, Tokugawa Ieyasu built what Japan had long been denied: peace. The Tokugawa shogunate rose like a fortress of discipline and silence. Roads were paved, cities flourished, and merchants replaced warlords. For the first time in centuries, the swords of the samurai rested in their scabbards. But beneath this peace, a quiet sorrow grew. For those who had lived by the blade, peace was both salvation and exile. The samurai found themselves torn between duty and disappearance. Their loyalty still burned, but their purpose was fading. The young men who once trained for war now served as administrators, guards, and teachers. The clashing of steel was replaced by the scratching of brushes on paper. Their code Bushido remained, but their world had changed forever. In Edo, the new capital, the shogun's court glimmered with restrained beauty. Cherry blossoms fell over stone courtyards where once soldiers had marched. Ieyasu, now old and revered, would often gaze upon his armor, the same one he had worn at Sekigahara, and whispered to his retainers, "Peace is the hardest battle of all." His words would linger like incense in the halls of time. Yet, as generations passed, the blade began to lose its light. The samurai's children grew in an age of stillness, where glory came not from war, but from wisdom and service. Some accepted this new Japan, others could not. They wandered in the mountains, swords at their sides, searching for a world that no longer existed. They became ghosts in their own land, relics of a forgotten thunder. When the winds of the modern age finally reached Japan, with ships of iron and foreign voices echoing across the seas, the samurai watched the old world crumble. Their swords, once symbols of divine honor, were now forbidden by law. Some hid them in silence, others broke them in tears. The blade that had once protected Japan now belonged to history. But legends do not die. Even as the samurai faded, their spirit remained in the pulse of the nation, in the discipline of soldiers, in the patience of craftsmen, in the courage of those who stand by their word. The age of the sword had ended, but the way of honor endured. As the sun set over Edo's golden rooftops, an old samurai stood on a bridge, watching his reflection ripple on the river. His armor was gone, his sword sheathed forever, but in his eyes burned the same flame that had once lit the battlefields of Kamakura, Kyushu, and Sekigahara. He whispered to the wind, "We have served our time. Now let the peace we fought for live on." The wind carried his words through the city, past temples and markets, up into the mountains, where cherry trees bloomed again. There, beneath their falling petals, Japan finally found its silence, not the silence of death, but of peace earned through centuries of struggle. The samurai's journey was over, but their honor became eternal.